If you think every father wants the richest man for his daughter, you haven't heard my story. The ballroom fell into a silence so complete that even the string quartet lowered their bows. More than 300 guests turned toward Richard Carter as he stood beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers of the Grand Lexington Hotel in Charlotte, North Carolina. His daughter Emily, dressed in an elegant ivory gown, stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Beside her stood Daniel Brooks, a polished young millionaire whose tailored tuxedo, luxury watch, and confident smile had convinced everyone in the room that this evening would end with applause and champagne. Richard slowly lifted the microphone, his weathered hand steady despite the weight of what he was about to say. Every executive, politician, and longtime family friend leaned forward. "This engagement is canceled," he announced. A wave of disbelief swept through the ballroom like a cold winter wind. Glasses paused halfway to waiting lips. Cameras stopped flashing. Daniel's smile disappeared in an instant. Before anyone could ask why, Richard turned toward the back of the room, where a tall black man stood quietly beside the entrance, wearing a simple navy blue suit that had clearly been pressed with care but had seen many special occasions before. His shoes were polished, though worn at the edges. In his hands rested a small velvet ring box that looked older than he was. "Marcus," Richard called, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Come here, son." Every head turned. Marcus Reed hesitated, convinced he had misunderstood. He wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't a lawyer, a surgeon, or the owner of a successful company. He spent his days climbing ladders, repairing electrical systems, replacing damaged wiring, and making sure families had light when darkness threatened to settle into their homes. His paycheck covered rent for the modest apartment he shared with his aging mother on the east side of town, and little more. He owned one pickup truck with over 200,000 miles on the odometer, and every dent on its faded blue body carried the memory of another long day's work. Yet as nervous as he felt, Marcus straightened his shoulders and began walking through the sea of expensive suits and glittering evening gowns. The room watched him with open curiosity. Some guests exchanged puzzled whispers. Others quietly judged him before he reached the center aisle. Richard waited without moving. Emily could barely breathe. Only 3 days earlier, Marcus had stood outside the gates of the Carter estate, holding that same velvet ring box, wondering whether courage alone could ever outweigh money. He remembered tightening his grip around the tiny box until his knuckles turned pale, taking one slow breath before ringing the bell that would change every life connected to that mansion forever. He had not come to ask for a loan, a favor, or a job. He had come to ask the wealthiest father in the county for the one thing no amount of money could ever truly buy. Marcus stopped a few feet from Richard, the polished hardwood floor reflecting the glow of the chandeliers beneath his worn dress shoes. The old velvet ring box suddenly felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. Around him, conversations dissolved into whispers that traveled through the ballroom like invisible waves. Some guests recognized him immediately. "Is that the electrician?" one woman murmured behind a champagne glass. Another quietly replied, "He fixed our church after the storm last spring." Daniel Brooks folded his arms, his confidence slowly returning as he studied the man standing across from him. In Daniel's eyes, Marcus looked completely out of place among investment bankers, judges, and business owners whose fortunes could purchase entire neighborhoods. Emily, however, saw something entirely different. She saw the same gentle man who had once spent an entire Saturday repairing the wiring at a community center without accepting a single dollar because children needed the lights back before their evening basketball practice. She remembered the afternoon they first met nearly 4 years earlier. A sudden summer thunderstorm had knocked out power across half the neighborhood. Emily had been volunteering at a food pantry when the lights failed. While everyone else complained about delays, Marcus quietly unpacked his tools from the back of his aging pickup truck. He climbed into the cramped utility room, worked for nearly 2 hours in sweltering heat, and finally restored power just before hundreds of pounds of refrigerated food spoiled. When the director tried to pay him extra, Marcus smiled and shook his head. "Use it to feed another family," he had said before driving away. That simple sentence never left Emily's heart. Over the following months, their paths crossed again at neighborhood fundraisers, church events, and volunteer projects. Marcus never chased attention. He never tried to impress anyone with expensive clothes or dramatic speeches. Instead, he listened more than he talked. He remembered birthdays. He carried groceries for elderly neighbors without waiting to be asked. When Emily's car refused to start one freezing January morning, Marcus spent nearly an hour replacing the battery in temperatures barely above 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Afterward, he refused every attempt she made to repay him. Someday, he had said with an easy smile, just help somebody else. Richard noticed all of it, even if he never admitted it aloud. At first, he had dismissed Marcus as another passing chapter in his daughter's life. After all, Emily had grown up surrounded by privilege. Her future seemed destined to include country clubs, charity galas, and corporate boardrooms. Marcus belonged to a different world, one measured by early mornings, steady hands, and honest work. Richard believed those worlds rarely lasted together. Then, 3 days before this very evening, his estate's security camera captured Marcus standing patiently outside the front gate carrying nothing but that weathered ring box. He could have mailed a letter or asked Emily privately. Instead, Marcus insisted on looking her father in the eye before asking for permission. Richard watched the young man through the study window for nearly 5 minutes before finally telling the housekeeper, "Show him in." Neither of them realized that the conversation waiting beyond those oak doors would quietly challenge everything Richard Carter believed about success, family, and the true measure of a man. The study smelled faintly of cedarwood and freshly brewed coffee as Marcus stepped inside the Carter estate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked perfectly trimmed gardens stretching across nearly 2 acres, while shelves filled with awards, photographs, and leather-bound books quietly told the story of a man who had spent 40 years building one of the largest financial firms in the state. Richard Carter remained standing beside the fireplace instead of offering Marcus a seat. The silence lasted several long seconds. It was not meant to be cruel. It was meant to reveal character. Marcus did not rush to fill it. He simply waited with both hands resting around the old velvet ring box. Richard finally broke the silence. "You know who I am." Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir." Richard continued, his voice measured and calm. "Then you also know I can give my daughter a life without financial worries. Tell me why she should choose yours instead." Marcus lowered his eyes for only a moment before looking directly back at him. There was no arrogance in his expression, only quiet conviction. "Because I cannot promise luxury every day," he answered. "But I can promise that she will never question whether she is respected, protected, and loved." Richard studied him carefully. The answer was not polished. It sounded nothing like the presentations he heard inside boardrooms every week. Yet somehow it carried more weight than expensive promises ever had. Before Richard could respond, the study door opened softly. Daniel Brooks entered with an easy smile, carrying a folder filled with architectural drawings for the luxury home he planned to build after marrying Emily. He stopped when he noticed Marcus standing near the fireplace. "I did not realize there was another meeting," Daniel said politely, though the confidence in his tone suggested he already believed he belonged there. Richard gestured for him to come inside. Within moments, the room held 2 men from completely different worlds. One spoke the language of investments, acquisitions, and market forecasts. The other spent his mornings carrying tool bags into homes where families simply hoped the lights would come back on. Richard asked them both the same question. "What does marriage mean to you?" Daniel answered immediately. "Security, stability, opportunity. I want Emily to experience everything life can offer." It was a polished response, the kind investors applauded during annual meetings. Then Richard turned toward Marcus. Marcus remained quiet for several seconds, as though choosing every word with care. "Marriage means becoming the safest place another person can come home to," he finally said. Even on the hardest days. The room fell still once again. Outside, a gentle breeze moved through the oak trees beyond the windows, scattering golden leaves across the stone walkway. Richard looked from one man to the other without revealing a single emotion. Then he walked toward the window and folded his hands behind his back. "Words are easy," he said without turning around. "The next 2 days will tell me everything I need to know." Neither Marcus nor Daniel understood what he meant. But as they quietly left the study through separate doors, Richard had already made a decision that neither of them could possibly see. He would not measure either man by the size of his bank account. He would measure them by the choices they made when they believed nobody important was watching. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale autumn sunlight, and Richard Carter left his estate before sunrise without informing either man of his plans. Instead of driving toward his downtown office, he parked an unmarked sedan across the street from the modest electrical company where Marcus reported every weekday at exactly 7 o'clock. At 6:58, Marcus stepped out of his faded blue pickup truck carrying a weathered tool bag over one shoulder and a steaming paper cup of black coffee in his hand. Before he reached the front door, an elderly woman struggled to lift two heavy grocery bags from the trunk of her compact car. Marcus glanced at his watch, then immediately changed direction. He carried every bag to her porch, smiled as she thanked him, and hurried back toward work without accepting the $20 bill she tried to press into his hand. Richard watched quietly from behind the windshield. It was a small moment, easy to miss, yet impossible to fake. Later that morning, another call came across the dispatch radio. A community recreation center on the south side had lost power in the children's art room. Marcus and another technician arrived within 30 minutes. While his co-worker prepared equipment, Marcus noticed several children sitting patiently with unfinished paintings, their brushes drying beneath dim emergency lights. He apologized to every child as though the inconvenience were somehow his responsibility. Less than 40 minutes later, the lights flickered back to life, and bright smiles filled the room before applause echoed off the painted walls. The center director thanked Marcus and offered him a generous bonus because the repair had been completed ahead of schedule. Marcus politely declined. "Please spend it on new supplies," he said. "Those kids need fresh paint more than I need another check." Richard wrote nothing down. He simply watched. Across town, Daniel Brooks spent the same morning touring a luxury property with architects and investors. Every conversation centered on square footage, imported stone, custom wine storage, and private theater seating. When one assistant accidentally delivered outdated blueprints, Daniel sighed with visible frustration before instructing the team to correct the mistake and continue. There was nothing cruel in his behavior, but Richard noticed something important. Daniel measured nearly every interaction by efficiency, while Marcus measured people by need. As afternoon sunlight stretched across the sidewalks, Richard made one final stop. Emily had volunteered that evening at the neighborhood food pantry where she and Marcus first met years before. Without warning, nearly twice as many families arrived as expected. Shelves emptied quickly. Volunteers hurried between tables trying to organize donations. Marcus had just finished a full day climbing ladders and replacing damaged wiring. Yet he appeared carrying fresh bread from a local bakery that had agreed to donate unsold loaves. He spent the next 3 hours unloading boxes, greeting children by name, helping elderly visitors carry groceries to their cars, and quietly repairing a broken wheelchair ramp before anyone even asked. Emily noticed none of it because she was busy serving meals inside. Richard noticed every detail from across the parking lot. The cool evening air carried the scent of fresh bread and fallen leaves as he remained seated inside his car long after the volunteers had gone home. For the first time in many years, he questioned whether success had blinded him to qualities that could never be measured on a balance sheet. As he started the engine, his phone lit up with a message from a private investigator he had quietly hired to learn more about both men. Richard opened Daniel's report first, and the expression on his face slowly changed. Richard remained inside the parked sedan long after the parking lot had emptied. The dashboard clock glowed 9:17 in soft blue light, while the private investigator's report rested unopened on the passenger seat. Finally, he picked it up and began reading. Marcus Reed, age 32, no criminal record, excellent employment history, consistent volunteer work, financial savings, modest, credit score, respectable despite a small income. Richard turned another page and found handwritten notes from interviews with neighbors. Always helps without being asked. Fixed my porch lights after the tornado and refused payment. Looks after his mother every Sunday. Richard slowly lowered the folder into his lap. There was nothing spectacular inside it. No hidden fortune. No famous relatives. No secret inheritance. Only years of ordinary decisions made with extraordinary consistency. Then he opened Daniel Brooks's file. The first pages highlighted everything Richard already knew. Successful investments, prestigious universities, board memberships, luxury real estate holdings. Yet deeper in the report, the tone quietly changed. Several former employees described Daniel as brilliant but dismissive. Vendors mentioned promises that were often delayed when they no longer served his interests. One business partner recalled Daniel abandoning a community housing project because profit margins had become too small. None of it was illegal. None of it suggested scandal. But together they revealed a pattern Richard could no longer ignore. Daniel excelled at building wealth. Marcus excelled at building trust. As Richard closed both folders, a memory returned with surprising clarity. Nearly 35 years earlier, he had been sitting beside his late wife, Sarah, on the front steps of their first apartment. Rain leaked through the old roof. The refrigerator barely worked, and together they owned less furniture than what now filled a single guest room in his mansion. Yet Sarah had smiled that evening and whispered something he had never forgotten. "I would rather struggle beside a good man than live in luxury beside the wrong one." Richard had promised never to forget those words. Somewhere along the decades of mergers, investments, and endless meetings, he had done exactly that. The next morning, he invited Emily to breakfast on the estate's back terrace overlooking the lake. A thin layer of mist drifted across the still water while cardinals landed among the maple trees. Emily sensed immediately that something had changed. Her father looked unusually quiet. He stirred his coffee without taking a sip. Finally, he asked a question that surprised her. "When did you know Marcus was the one?" Emily smiled gently. "The day I realized he treated strangers with the same kindness he showed me." Richard looked up. "Not when he told you he loved you." Emily shook her head. "Words are easy, Dad. Character repeats itself every single day." The sentence settled into the morning silence like a stone sinking beneath calm water. Richard glanced across the lake, watching sunlight slowly burn away the fog. At that moment, he understood why no report, no interview, and no financial statement could answer the question that truly mattered. Wealth could create comfort. Reputation could open doors. Success could earn admiration. But none of those things guaranteed the quiet faithfulness required to build a family. As he stood from the table, his phone vibrated once more. His event coordinator confirmed that every guest had arrived for the engagement celebration that evening. Richard slipped the phone into his jacket pocket, took one slow breath, and quietly made the decision that would leave an entire ballroom speechless before the night was over. Marcus reached the center of the ballroom and stopped beside Emily without saying a single word. The old velvet ring box remained closed in his hands, its edges softened by time and generations of careful keeping. Around him, hundreds of guests waited for someone to explain the impossible scene unfolding before their eyes. Daniel Brooks broke the silence first. He forced a polite smile that could no longer hide his confusion. "Richard, I believe everyone deserves an explanation." His voice echoed through the grand hall before fading into another uneasy silence. Richard nodded slowly. "You are right." He stepped away from the microphone and looked directly at Daniel. "You are an intelligent man. You have built remarkable success. You will continue to do well in life." Daniel relaxed slightly, believing the conversation had turned back in his favor. But Richard continued. "However, during the past 2 days, I stopped looking at resumes and started looking at people." The room grew still again. Richard spoke without raising his voice. "I watched one man spend hours helping people who could never repay him. I watched another spend every hour protecting investments that already belonged to him. Neither choice was illegal. Neither choice was wrong. But only one choice reminded me of the husband I once promised my wife I would become." Emily lowered her eyes, quietly wiping away a tear before anyone noticed. Marcus remained motionless, almost uncomfortable becoming the center of attention. Richard slowly turned toward him. "Marcus, when you came to my house 3 days ago, I expected you to tell me how you planned to provide luxury for my daughter." Marcus answered honestly. "I could not say that because it would not have been true." Richard smiled gently. "Exactly." Several guests exchanged puzzled glances. Richard looked across the ballroom filled with polished marble, crystal chandeliers, and tables decorated with white roses. "I have spent most of my life believing success could protect the people I love. It can protect them from many things. It can buy comfort. It can buy security. But it cannot buy patience at 2 o'clock in the morning. It cannot buy kindness after a difficult day. It cannot buy loyalty when nobody is watching." His words settled over the room like quiet snowfall. Even the musicians remained perfectly still. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a faded photograph. It showed a much younger Richard standing beside his late wife outside a tiny apartment building with peeling paint and cracked concrete steps. They were smiling as though they owned the world. He held the picture up for Emily to see. "Your mother once told me that character grows long before wealth ever arrives. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that lesson." He folded the photograph and returned it to his pocket with slow, deliberate care. Then he faced Marcus once more. "You never tried to impress me. You never pretended to be someone you were not. You simply lived your values every single day." Marcus lowered his head respectfully. "That is how my mother raised me, sir." Richard felt his throat tighten. For a brief moment, the enormous ballroom disappeared. All he could hear was Sarah's voice from decades earlier reminding him that the strongest foundation for any family was never money but integrity. He took Emily's trembling hand, then gently placed it into Marcus's open palm. The room remained silent. Yet just as Marcus looked into Emily's tearful eyes and slowly opened the old velvet ring box, the massive ballroom doors swung open again, and an unexpected voice called out from across the hall. "Richard, before you bless this marriage, there is something you deserve to know about Marcus Reed." Every conversation stopped. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed to disappear as an elderly woman stepped through the ballroom doors carrying a worn leather folder against her chest. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and although she walked with the help of a polished wooden cane, there was quiet confidence in every step. Marcus recognized her instantly. "Mrs. Evelyn Harper," he whispered under his breath, surprise filling his voice. Emily looked from Marcus to the woman. Confused, Richard narrowed his eyes, waiting for her to continue. Mrs. Harper smiled warmly before speaking. "I apologize for interrupting, Richard, but you deserve to know exactly who this young man is." Daniel straightened immediately, convinced the unexpected interruption would finally expose something embarrassing. Several guests exchanged hopeful glances, expecting a hidden scandal or long-buried secret. Instead, Mrs. Harper slowly opened the old folder and removed several yellow documents along with faded newspaper clippings. 20 years ago, she began, my husband and I owned Harper Electric, one of the most respected electrical companies in this county. A few older guests nodded, recognizing the family name. Then my husband became seriously ill, and our business slowly collapsed. Most people walked away. She paused and looked directly at Marcus. Except one family. Marcus quietly lowered his head. Mrs. Harper continued. Marcus was only 12 years old when his father started spending every Saturday helping my husband maintain equipment, organize inventory, and finish projects that we could no longer handle alone. They never accepted payment. They simply said neighbors take care of neighbors. Richard listened without moving. Mrs. Harper carefully unfolded another document. After Marcus's father passed away several years later, this young man continued that promise. Every month, without fail, he visited me. Sometimes he repaired broken outlets. Sometimes he cleaned gutters. Sometimes he simply sat with me for an hour because he knew grief makes a house feel much larger than it really is. A heavy silence settled across the ballroom. Daniel slowly looked toward the floor. Mrs. Harper smiled through moist eyes. Last winter, my furnace stopped working during the coldest week of the year. Marcus spent nearly 6 hours fixing it after finishing a full workday. When I offered him every dollar I had saved, he gently closed my hand and told me to use the money for medication instead. Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. Emily reached for Marcus's hand without taking her eyes off Mrs. Harper. You want to know what kind of man is standing beside your daughter? The elderly woman asked softly. Look beyond his paycheck. Look beyond his truck. Look beyond his suit. Measure him by the people whose lives became easier because he quietly entered them. She handed Richard one final envelope. Inside was a simple handwritten letter from Marcus's late father, written years before his passing. The final sentence had been underlined twice. It read, Son, if people remember your kindness longer than they remember your success, you have already lived a wealthy life. Richard slowly folded the letter, unable to speak for several long seconds. Across the ballroom, many guests quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Daniel finally stepped forward, not with anger, but with humility. He looked at Marcus and gave a small respectful nod. I thought I was competing against another man, he admitted quietly. I was really competing against the kind of person I still hope to become. Richard slowly walked toward Marcus until only a single step separated them. The ballroom remained completely still, as though no one wanted to disturb the weight of the moment. He looked down at the weathered velvet ring box and gently smiled. "Your father gave you more than a family heirloom," he said quietly. "He gave you a way to live." Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes glistening beneath the warm chandelier light. "Everything I am began with my parents, sir. I have only tried not to disappoint them." Richard nodded, understanding those words more deeply than anyone else in the room. He turned toward the guests, many of whom had spent years measuring success through titles, luxury homes, and investment portfolios. "For decades," Richard began, "people have congratulated me for building a successful company. Tonight, I realized something that should have been obvious long ago. Businesses grow because of strategy. Families grow because of character. Those are not the same thing." A quiet murmur swept through the audience before fading once again. Richard extended his hand toward Daniel. For a brief second, nobody knew what would happen next. Daniel accepted the handshake with genuine respect. "You have remarkable talent," Richard told him. "Never lose that. But never allow success to become more important than the people standing beside you." Daniel lowered his head. "I understand now," he replied sincerely. "I have spent years trying to become impressive instead of becoming dependable." Richard smiled gently. "That realization may become your greatest achievement." Daniel turned toward Marcus. The rivalry that had filled the room only minutes earlier disappeared from his expression. "Take good care of her," he said. Marcus answered without hesitation. "Every single day." Emily wiped away another quiet tear as Richard placed both of their hands together once more. This time there was no uncertainty in his movements, only peace. The old velvet ring box opened at last, revealing a simple gold ring whose surface reflected the ballroom lights with quiet elegance rather than extravagance. Marcus lifted the ring carefully. "This belonged to my grandmother," he explained softly. "Then my father carried it until the day he passed it to me. He told me that love becomes stronger every time it is shared with faithfulness." Emily smiled through tears. "Then I will wear it proudly." Marcus gently placed the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had always belonged there. A wave of warm applause finally filled the ballroom, not loud or explosive, but steady and heartfelt. Even those who had quietly doubted Marcus only moments earlier now stood to honor what they had witnessed. Mrs. Evelyn Harper closed her eyes with gratitude. Several older guests smiled as memories of their own humble beginnings returned. Richard glanced toward the large windows overlooking the gardens where the last light of sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and amber. For the first time in many years, the mansion, the business empire, and every achievement he had ever collected seemed strangely small beside the quiet dignity standing before him. He rested one hand on Marcus's shoulder and spoke the words his daughter would remember for the rest of her life. A father spends years wondering who will protect his child after he no longer can. Tonight, I stopped looking for the richest man in the room. I found the one with the richest heart. Welcome to our family, my son. The celebration continued long after the musicians began playing again, but the moment people remembered most happened after the applause had faded. Marcus quietly stepped away from the center of the ballroom and walked toward Mrs. Evelyn Harper before anyone noticed. He thanked her with the same humility that had guided him his entire life. She smiled and gently adjusted the collar of his suit, as though he were still the 12-year-old boy who had once followed his father from one repair job to another carrying a toolbox almost too heavy for his small hands. Richard watched from across the room and realized something remarkable. Marcus never stood at the center of any story for very long before turning the attention toward someone else. That quiet habit revealed more about his character than any speech ever could. Later that evening, as guests slowly departed beneath strings of warm garden lights, Daniel approached Marcus one final time. There was no bitterness left in his expression, only gratitude. "Thank you," he said sincerely. Marcus looked surprised. "For what?" Daniel smiled. "For reminding me that success is something you earn every day, not something you purchase once." They shook hands, not as rivals, but as two men who had both learned something worth carrying into the future. Emily watched them from the terrace, the simple gold ring catching the soft evening light every time she reached for Marcus's hand. It was not the largest diamond in the room, nor the most expensive piece of jewelry anyone had seen that night. Yet somehow it had become the most admired because everyone now understood what it represented. Richard stepped outside alone for a few quiet minutes. A cool breeze moved through the maple trees, carrying the familiar scent of autumn leaves across the estate. He looked toward the distant lights of the city where he had spent decades chasing one achievement after another. For the first time, none of those accomplishments felt as important as the peace resting in his daughter's smile. He reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded the old photograph of himself and Sarah one more time. Running, his thumb gently across its worn edges, he whispered, "You were right all along." In that silent moment, he understood that the greatest inheritance a parent could leave behind was never money, property, or influence. It was the wisdom to recognize goodness when it quietly appeared. Marcus soon joined him on the terrace without saying a word. The two men stood side by side looking toward the stars beginning to appear above the North Carolina sky. Richard finally broke the silence. "Take care of each other." Marcus nodded once. "Every day, sir." Richard smiled gently. "You can call me Dad now." Marcus's eyes filled again, but this time they carried only gratitude. Behind them, Emily stepped onto the terrace and slipped her hand into Marcus's. No photographers followed. No speeches remained. Only 3 people stood together beneath a peaceful evening sky, knowing that the strongest families are not built on wealth but on trust, kindness, and the quiet courage to choose character over appearances every single day.